The purpose of the course, as has been said, is to move the archetypes or myths forward and give them modern dress. As I said, we chose films that resonate with the themes that we are going to discover as we look at it thematically in the Red Book. In 1912, Jung had what was for him a very catastrophic experience. It grew gradually, but it was a break from Freud, who had been his mentor, a father figure for him. The break was coming because as Jung became more and more of himself and his own ideas about symbol came to the forefront, he could no longer truly support what he saw as Freud's main thrust, which was sexuality. He couldn't agree with Freud. And he kept his own ideas under wraps for quite a while because he looked up to Freud. He was considered the heir apparent to Freud, and I think he earned a lot of status in the psychological community because of his association with Freud. So the break, when it came, was really a severing of a relationship that had been extremely close between the two men. And it was, for Jung, it was a break in his father complex. It stimulated for him chaos. I don't think he could have predicted what was going to happen to him psychologically. He was plunged into a kind of descent, a chaotic breakdown. Now he felt he was able to continue much of his activity. For instance, he had a family, he could continue his practice. He gave up on some of his activities, his teaching activities, but more and more he felt in order to justify what's happening to me, what is coming up in me, and it began with some visions when he was on a train, and then he had two visions, and they were catastrophic visions that involved Europe being overrun with water and blood. And he didn't realize that in a sense he was picking up what might have been underground in the unconscious of Europe at the time, the tumult and what was building. He didn't quite know it. He tried to relate it to himself. He was able to say, well, yeah, maybe this is a picture of what's happened to me in my unconscious, but he was puzzled. He didn't quite get that. He thought that the way into his own imagination or unconscious might be to allow himself to drop down into playing, and he did that literally to stimulate his own imagination. He sat by the seashore and played as he had as a boy with stones. I mean, the courage of the man, in a sense. Here he was, a man of great notoriety, success, ambition, and he's sitting on the seashore of the Zürichsee playing with stones. But he was right. His intuition told him what he had to do, and that was to open up his own, a channel to his own unconscious. In order to do that, he had to begin to sacrifice something, and the sacrifice was what he came to call later the heroic in himself. He had an image of himself. He was vain, he was egotistical, he was a bit of a bully. And how did he get in touch with that? How did he come to see these traits in himself? And the remarkable thing was that he was open to this material that we now call shadow. The not me, the part of me I don't want to look at. So he had to sacrifice his own self-image, which was a heroic image. He had already given up on Freud, but interestingly enough, some of the images of Freud that he began to find in himself in personifications in his own dreams were absolutely Freud-like in himself. So he had to see some of these projections, the way he saw Freud, which was arrogant, full of hubris, egotistical, ambitious, were really in himself. And that was jolting. It must have felt like madness. It really must have. He decided that he would look at everything that came up from his own unconscious, dreams, visions, and including everything that drew his own anger and contempt. That was, I think, a very brave thing to say. That was really uncomfortable. What he was contemptuous of, in a sense, he was going to have to face in himself. Now, how did it happen? It happened that he began to have dreams and visions and what we now call a process that he engaged in called active imagination. But it came up as figures, very vivid figures from his own unconscious. He took them seriously. Up came a figure of Elijah, the wise old man. Up came Salome from the Bible, whom he knew about. And he was a reader of the Bible, so his images were peopled with biblical figures, just as ours and my clients, for instance, are often peopled with film images or people in the political life. For him, it was biblical figures. At least those are the ones he's told us about. He decided what he would do is have the ego, his own ego, hold its ground, keep its own opinion, and dialogue or argue with these figures. Take them on, in a way, with the attitude of, who are you? What do you have to teach me? Why are you here? So he didn't surrender at all, even to the wise old man or to any of them. He kept his own ego. He would be rude to these figures. He would have an ongoing dialogue with them. What he discovered is that his own ego perspective, as his own ego perspective began to change, the figures in the unconscious began to evolve and change. So that was fascinating. In other words, over time, the Elijah figure morphed into a different figure whom he came to call Philemon, a spirit guide. And Salome, who had been blind in the beginning, was healed. Her blindness was healed by a confrontation with Elijah. He began to think about these characters and really know them, and know them as parts of himself. He called Salome an anima figure, a soul figure. And he began to feel that the feminine in his own unconscious was a very important function, a very important figure, whom he had to know better.